The restaurant was busier than usual that Thursday evening. Every table in the main dining room was filled, and the sound of clinking glasses and quiet conversation created a steady hum throughout the space. In the middle of it all, rushing between tables with practiced efficiency, was a young woman who had been working there for the past 3 years. She balanced a tray of drinks on one hand while pushing through the kitchen door with her shoulder. This was her second shift of the day. She'd been there since lunch service and wouldn't leave until well past midnight. The exhaustion was becoming normal now, just another part of her routine that she'd learned to push through. Nobody at the restaurant knew much about her personal life. She was polite, efficient, and never complained. She showed up on time, did her work, and went home. That was enough for everyone. What they didn't know was that every dollar she earned was carefully counted and saved. Her younger brother was sick, really sick, and the medical bills were piling up faster than she could manage. The restaurant where she worked wasn't just any place. It was one of those upscale establishments where wealthy people came to celebrate deals and impress clients. The Grand Vista sat on the 20th floor of a downtown building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the entire city. The decor was elegant, almost too elegant. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, and in the corner of the main hall, a beautiful grand piano that nobody ever touched. That piano had always caught her attention. Every time she walked past it, something stirred inside her chest. A memory, maybe, or a regret. She tried not to look at it too much. Some doors were better left closed. The evening took an unexpected turn when the manager gathered the staff in the back hallway. His face was flushed with excitement and stress in equal measure. They were getting a last-minute private booking, he explained. A very important client with very specific demands. The entire main dining room would be reserved for his party. The important client turned out to be someone most people had heard of. He was a tech billionaire, one of those men whose face appeared in business magazines and news articles. He'd made his fortune young and had a reputation for being brilliant, demanding, and more than a little difficult to deal with. When he arrived that evening with a group of well-dressed associates, the entire staff went into high alert mode. He walked through the restaurant like he owned it, which, given his wealth, he probably could have if he wanted to. He examined everything with a critical eye, making comments about the wine selection and the temperature of the room. The manager followed behind him, nodding and agreeing with everything he said. Then the billionaire noticed the piano. He stopped in front of it, running his hand along the polished surface. He turned to the manager with a look of genuine confusion. Why was there a piano in the restaurant if nobody played it? What was the point of having such a beautiful instrument just sitting there as decoration? The manager stammered through an explanation. The piano had come with the space. It was part of the ambiance. Nobody on staff played, so they kept it as a visual element. Guests seemed to like having it there. The billionaire's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like amusement. He announced, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, that he found this ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Here was this magnificent instrument, capable of creating beautiful music, and it was being treated like a piece of furniture. He turned to his associates and declared that he wouldn't proceed with dinner until someone played that piano. The manager's face went pale. He tried to explain that they really didn't have anyone who could play. Perhaps they could hire someone? But that would take time, and the billionaire shook his head. No, he said with a wave of his hand. Someone here must play. What about the staff? Surely someone knew how to play piano. The kitchen staff and servers were quickly questioned. Nobody could play. The manager was sweating now, realizing that he was about to lose a $50,000 booking over something as simple as piano music. The billionaire seemed to be enjoying the chaos he was creating, leaning against the piano with his arms crossed and a slight smirk on his face. That's when one of the other servers, a young guy who'd been there for about a year, suddenly remembered something. He'd seen a photo once, months ago, on her phone. She'd been looking at something during her break and he'd glanced over her shoulder. It was an old picture of a teenage girl at a piano, wearing a formal dress, clearly at some kind of competition or recital. He'd asked about it, but she'd quickly locked her phone and changed the subject. The server pulled the manager aside and whispered this information to him. The manager's eyes widened. He immediately walked over to where she was standing near the kitchen door, trying to stay invisible during all this commotion. She knew what was coming before he even opened his mouth. The look on his face told her everything. He asked her quietly, almost pleading if it was true. Could she play piano? She wanted to say no. She wanted to walk away. But she could see the desperation in his eyes, and she thought about the tip money she'd lose if this booking fell through. The restaurant would be closed for a private event, which meant no other tables, no other customers. She told him yes, she could play, but she hadn't in a very long time. The manager didn't care about the details. He grabbed her arm and practically pulled her toward where the billionaire was waiting. He announced that they did have someone who could play after all. The billionaire looked at her with raised eyebrows. This was his pianist? A waitress still wearing her apron? He laughed, not meanly exactly, but not kindly either. It was the laugh of someone who found the whole situation entertaining. She felt her face grow hot. She hadn't performed in front of anyone in over 2 years. The last time she'd played piano was before her father died, before everything in her life had fallen apart. Music had been her entire world once. She'd trained seriously, competed in state competitions, and had dreams of studying at a prestigious conservatory. But life had other plans. The billionaire seemed to sense her discomfort and decided to push further. He pulled out his wallet and made a show of counting out 5 $20 bills. He placed them on top of the piano and announced loudly that he'd pay her $100 to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Some of his associates laughed. One of them made a joke about whether waitresses even knew nursery rhymes. She stood there frozen, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on her. The humiliation burned through her chest. She could have walked away, should have walked away, but something was building inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just anger at being mocked, though that was part of it. It was something deeper. A voice she thought she'd silenced was suddenly speaking again. She walked to the piano bench and sat down. Her hands were shaking as she placed them on the keys. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, something had shifted. She knew exactly what she was going to play. And it wasn't going to be Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. She was going to play the piece her father had written for her 7 years ago. The one she'd never performed for anyone outside her family. The one she'd promised herself she'd play at her first major concert. The one that held every memory of who she used to be and who she still might become. Her fingers touched the keys, and the first notes filled the room. The first notes came out softer than she expected. Her fingers felt stiff, unfamiliar with the keys after so long away. For a brief moment, panic shot through her. What if she couldn't do this anymore? What if 2 years away from the piano had stolen whatever ability she once had? But then something remarkable happened. Her hands remembered what her mind had tried to forget. Muscle memory took over, and suddenly she wasn't thinking about the billionaire or his mocking smile, or the $100 sitting on top of the piano. She wasn't even thinking about the room full of people watching her. She was somewhere else entirely. The piece her father had written started simply, just a few notes. A gentle melody that sounded almost like a lullaby. Her father had always believed that the best music didn't show off. It didn't try to impress anyone. It just told the truth. And this piece told the truth about their relationship, about the hours they'd spent together at their old upright piano in their small apartment. She remembered those afternoons so clearly now. Her father would sit beside her on the bench, his patience endless as she struggled through difficult passages. He never got frustrated when she made mistakes. He would just smile and say, "Try it again, but this time feel what the music is trying to say. Don't just play the notes. Listen to what they mean." The melody began to shift. The simple theme became more complex, the chords deeper and richer. Her left hand moved across the lower keys while her right hand climbed higher, creating a conversation between two voices. This was the part her father called the struggle. Every story has conflict, he used to tell her. Every journey has obstacles. The music needs to show that. Around her, the restaurant had gone completely silent. The servers who had been preparing the tables stopped moving. The kitchen staff who had been working on the special menu stood still in the doorway. The billionaire's associates, who had been chatting amongst themselves and checking their phones, slowly turned their attention to the piano. She didn't notice any of it. She was lost in the music now and the memories it carried. As her fingers moved across the keys, she thought about the last time she'd played this piece. It had been at her father's bedside in the hospital, on a small keyboard her brother had brought from home. Her father had been too weak to speak by then, but when she played, tears had rolled down his cheeks. He'd squeezed her hand when she finished, and she knew he was telling her to keep going, to keep playing no matter what happened. But she hadn't kept playing. After he died, after the medical bills came and the insurance wasn't enough and their small savings disappeared, the piano had to be sold. It had broken her heart, but her brother needed treatment and there were no other options. She'd watched strangers carry that piano out of their apartment, taking with it every memory of her father, every dream she'd built around music. The piece moved into its most challenging section. Her hands flew across the keys now, the music building in intensity and emotion. This was the part that had always scared her when she was younger. It required complete technical control while simultaneously demanding raw emotional vulnerability. You couldn't fake this section. You either felt it or you didn't. She felt it now more than ever. Every loss, every sacrifice, every night she'd cried herself to sleep, wondering if things would ever get better. Every double shift she'd worked while her feet ached and her back screamed. Every time she'd visited her brother in the hospital and pretended to be strong when inside, she was terrified. All of it poured into the music. The billionaire was no longer smirking. He sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Something in his face had changed, though. The amusement was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition or maybe regret. His associates had stopped talking entirely. One woman had her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes glistening. The manager stood near the kitchen door, barely breathing. He'd never heard anything like this. None of them had. This wasn't just good piano playing. This was something else. This was someone's entire life translated into sound. The music began to soften again, moving toward its conclusion. The frantic energy of the middle section gave way to something that felt like acceptance or maybe hope. The two voices that had been fighting earlier started to harmonize, working together instead of against each other. This was her father's message, she realized now. After the struggle comes peace. After the darkness comes light. You just have to keep going. Her hands slowed, the notes becoming gentler, more spaced out. The final section was almost prayer-like in its simplicity. Just a few chords, a return to that original melody, but changed now. Wiser, sadder, but somehow stronger. She played the last notes so softly they were barely audible, letting them fade naturally into the air. When she lifted her hands from the keys, the silence in the room was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the sounds from outside, the distant traffic and city noise, seemed to have disappeared. For several long seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then someone started clapping. It was one of the billionaire's associates. A man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd never been moved by anything in his life. The applause started slowly but built quickly. Soon everyone in the room was clapping, some of them standing. The kitchen staff emerged fully from the doorway, applauding loudly. Even the bus boys who had been hiding in the back joined in. She stood up from the piano bench, her legs shaking so badly she worried they might give out. Her face felt hot and wet and she realized she was crying. She hadn't even noticed. She wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand. Embarrassed by her tears, by the attention, by all of it. The billionaire was still sitting, still not clapping, just watching her with that strange expression. She couldn't read his face. Was he angry? Impressed? She didn't know and honestly didn't care. She just wanted to get away, to escape back to the kitchen where things made sense and nobody asked her to reveal parts of herself she'd worked so hard to bury. She walked quickly toward the kitchen, keeping her eyes down, trying to ignore the applause that was still continuing. Several people tried to stop her, to say something, but she kept moving. The manager reached out to touch her arm as she passed, but she shook her head. She couldn't talk right now. If she tried to speak, she would fall apart completely. In the kitchen, she leaned against the wall and let herself breathe. Her hands were still trembling. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. She'd played her father's piece in front of strangers and somehow she'd survived. One of the other servers came into the kitchen, her eyes wide. That was incredible, she said. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Are you okay? Do you need anything? She nodded, not trusting her voice yet. She was okay. She would be okay. She just needed a minute to collect herself, to rebuild the walls she'd accidentally knocked down out there. But even as she tried to compose herself, tried to return to being just a waitress working a double shift, she knew something had shifted. You can't play music like that. Can't open yourself up that completely and then just go back to pretending nothing happened. In the dining room, the billionaire finally stood up. He walked slowly to the piano, picked up the five $20 bills he'd placed there earlier, and carefully folded them back into his wallet. Then he called for the manager. Something was about to change. She didn't know it yet, standing in that kitchen trying to catch her breath. But her life was about to take a turn she never could have imagined. She managed to finish her shift that night, though everything felt different afterward. The other servers kept looking at her with new eyes like they were seeing her for the first time. A few tried to ask questions about where she'd learned to play like that, but she gave short answers and kept moving. She didn't want to talk about it. Talking about it would make it real, and she wasn't ready for that. The billionaire and his guests had their dinner. They stayed for hours, ordering expensive wine and multiple courses. She avoided serving their section, letting the other waitstaff handle it. She couldn't face him again, couldn't stand the thought of pouring water or taking orders from the man who'd seen her break open like that. When her shift finally ended after midnight, she walked to the subway station in a daze. Her feet hurt like they always did, but tonight she barely noticed. Her mind kept replaying those minutes at the piano, the feeling of her hands on the keys, the music flowing through her like it had never stopped. She'd forgotten how much she missed it, or maybe she'd just been trying to forget. The next morning, she woke up to her phone buzzing. It was the manager calling, which was strange because it was her day off. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. He sounded different, excited, nervous. He told her she needed to come to the restaurant right away. When she asked why, he hesitated. There was an envelope waiting for her, he said. Someone had left it last night with strict instructions that it be given to her personally. She knew who it was from before he even said it. The billionaire had left something for her. Her stomach twisted. She didn't want his money or his pity or whatever this was, but the manager kept insisting, saying she really needed to come see this, that it was important. She took the subway back downtown, still wearing sweatpants and an old jacket. When she arrived at the restaurant, the manager was waiting by the front door. He handed her a thick cream-colored envelope with her name written on it in elegant handwriting. Inside was a check. She had to look at it twice to make sure she was reading the number correctly. $10,000. Her hand started shaking. She'd never seen a check for that much money in her entire life. Underneath the check was a handwritten note on expensive paper. The note was brief but specific. It gave the address of an office building downtown and a time for that afternoon. It said the billionaire wanted to meet with her privately to discuss something important. It was signed with just his initials. The manager was watching her face, trying to read her reaction. He asked what it said, if everything was okay. She folded the note and put it back in the envelope. She told him she had to go, that she'd see him at her next shift. He called after her, asking if she was going to cash the check, but she was already walking away. She spent the next few hours sitting in a coffee shop, staring at that check. Part of her wanted to rip it up. She didn't need his charity. She'd survived this long without handouts from wealthy people who threw money around like it meant nothing. But another part of her, the practical part that counted every dollar and knew exactly how much her brother's next treatment would cost, couldn't ignore what this money could do. At 2:30, she found herself standing outside a glass office building in the financial district. She rode the elevator to the 23rd floor, feeling completely out of place in her casual clothes. The reception area was all marble and modern furniture. The woman at the desk seemed to be expecting her, and directed her to a private office at the end of the hall. The billionaire was sitting behind a large desk, but when she entered, he stood up and gestured to a more comfortable seating area by the windows. He looked different than he had at the restaurant. Less performative somehow. More tired, he started by apologizing. Not a quick sorry, but a real apology. He said his behavior at the restaurant had been inappropriate and cruel. He admitted that he often acted that way, pushing people to see how they'd react, treating situations like games because he could. He said watching her play had made him ashamed of himself. She didn't know what to say to that. She sat there holding her bag in her lap, waiting for whatever came next. He told her he'd looked her up. He'd found her competition history, the awards she'd won as a teenager, the scholarship she'd been offered to a prestigious music program. He'd also found the news about her father's death, the gaps in her education, the public records of medical debt. He'd pieced together her story. She felt anger rise in her chest. He had no right to dig into her life like that. She stood up to leave, but he quickly asked her to wait to please just hear him out. What he said next surprised her. He told her about his own daughter, a girl who'd been incredibly talented at violin, who'd won competitions and dreamed of becoming a professional musician. But he'd pushed her away from music, convinced her to study business instead, to join his company. He'd told her that music was fine as a hobby but not as a career. He'd been so focused on building his empire that he'd crushed her dreams without even realizing it. His daughter didn't speak to him anymore. She worked at his company but kept him at a distance, polite but cold. He'd destroyed their relationship and he didn't know how to fix it. Watching a young woman play piano with that much passion and pain had forced him to see what he'd done. He made an offer then. He wanted to help her return to music. He would pay for her brother's medical expenses, all of them. He would fund her education at any music school that would accept her. He would give her the chance his own daughter never got. She stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. This had to be some kind of trick. People like him didn't just give away money. There had to be a catch, conditions, strings attached, but he insisted there were no conditions. He didn't want anything from her. No performances at his events, no publicity, nothing. He just wanted to do something good for once, something that wasn't about making more money or expanding his business. He wanted to give someone the opportunity he'd stolen from his own child. She asked the obvious question. Why her? There were thousands of talented people struggling to afford their dreams. Why was she special? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you reminded me what music is supposed to be. Not entertainment for wealthy people at fancy dinners. Not background noise, but something real and true and necessary. You played like your life depended on it because maybe it did. That's worth preserving." She felt tears starting again and blinked them back. She couldn't let herself hope for this. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment, and she'd had enough of that to last a lifetime. She told him she needed time to think. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. He said the offer had no expiration date. Whenever she was ready, if she was ever ready, she could reach out. As she stood to leave, he stopped her with one more thing. He asked if she'd consider, maybe in the future, talking to his daughter. Not now, not until she was comfortable. But someday, if she was willing, maybe she could tell his daughter what music meant to her. Maybe hearing it from someone who'd fought so hard to hold on to their dreams would mean more than anything he could say. She didn't promise anything, but she didn't say no either. She walked out of that office building and back into the bright afternoon sun, clutching that check in her pocket, her mind spinning with possibilities she'd stopped letting herself imagine years ago. The question was whether she could trust this, whether she could let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, things could actually get better. She didn't cash the check right away. For 3 days it sat on her small kitchen table while she stared at it during her meals, trying to decide what to do. Her brother noticed her distraction when she visited him at the treatment center. He asked what was wrong, and for the first time in years, she told someone the whole story. Her brother listened quietly, his thin face serious despite the exhaustion that always hung around his eyes these days. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised her. He told her she'd be stupid not to take the money. Not for him, though he admitted the medical bills were crushing, but for herself, because she'd given up too much already, and if someone was offering her a second chance, she had no right to refuse it out of pride. She argued with him. She said it felt wrong taking money from a stranger, that there had to be strings attached even if she couldn't see them yet. That accepting help meant admitting she couldn't do it on her own. Her brother laughed at that, a weak sound but genuine. He reminded her that she'd been accepting help her whole life, from teachers who stayed late to work with her, from neighbors who'd driven her to competitions, from their father who'd sacrificed so much to pay for her lessons. There was no shame in accepting help. The shame was in letting pride destroy your future. She left the treatment center that evening with her brother's words echoing in her head. She stopped at a bank branch on the way home and deposited the check before she could change her mind. Watching the teller process, it felt surreal, like she was doing something illegal even though she wasn't. That night, she called the number the billionaire had given her. A secretary answered and scheduled another meeting for the following week. The days leading up to it felt endless. She kept working her shifts at the restaurant, but everything felt temporary now, like she was watching her own life from outside her body. The second meeting was different from the first. This time, there were other people involved. A lawyer who explained that the money for her brother's treatments would be set up through a medical trust. An education consultant who had already contacted several prestigious music programs on her behalf. A financial advisor who would help her manage the funds responsibly. It was overwhelming. She'd expected a conversation, maybe some paperwork. Instead, she was being handed an entirely new life, wrapped up and presented like a gift she wasn't sure she deserved. The billionaire himself was quieter this time, letting his team do most of the talking. But toward the end of the meeting, he asked to speak with her alone. After everyone else left, he told her something important. He said he was setting this up as a loan, not a gift, because he understood she needed to feel like she'd earned it. The terms were simple. No interest, no payment schedule. She could pay it back whenever she was able, even if that took 20 years or never happened at all. She felt something loosen in her chest. A loan she could accept. A loan meant this was temporary help, not charity. It meant she still had her dignity, her independence. She agreed to the terms, but then she added her own condition. She said she'd accept his help, but only if he did something for him. He needed to reach out to his daughter. Really reach out, not just send a message through an assistant. He needed to apologize to her the way he'd apologize to a stranger in his office. He needed to try. He looked uncomfortable with that. He said his daughter wouldn't want to hear from him, that he'd already caused too much damage. But she pushed back. She told him that her own father had made mistakes too, had sometimes pushed too hard or expected too much. But she would give anything to have one more conversation with him, one more chance to understand each other. His daughter deserved that chance, even if she didn't know it yet. He finally nodded, though he looked uncertain. He said he'd try, but he couldn't promise anything. The next few weeks moved quickly. She gave notice at the restaurant, working her final shifts in a blur of mixed emotions. Her coworkers threw her a small party on her last day, and the manager gave her an envelope with gift cards and a note thanking her for her years of service. Several servers asked for her contact information, promising to stay in touch, though she suspected most of them wouldn't. Her brother's treatments were transferred to a better facility, one with newer equipment and more specialized doctors. The change in his condition was almost immediate. With proper care and medication, he started gaining weight and energy. The gray pallor left his skin. He started talking about the future again, about what he wanted to do when he was healthy. She enrolled in a prestigious conservatory program that started in the fall. Until then, she had months to prepare, to practice, to rebuild the skills she'd let deteriorate. She found a practice space at a community center and spent hours there every day, her fingers remembering patterns they'd learned years ago. But the hardest part wasn't the practice or the preparation. It was allowing herself to hope. Every time she sat at a piano, she waited for someone to tell her this was all a mistake, that she had to go back to her old life. She kept expecting the billionaire to call and say he'd changed his mind, that the deal was off. He never did. Instead, about a month after their last meeting, she received a message from him. It was brief. He'd taken her advice and reached out to his daughter. They'd met for coffee. It had been awkward and painful and difficult, but they'd talked for 2 hours. His daughter hadn't forgiven him yet, maybe never would, but she'd agreed to try. They had another meeting scheduled for the following week. He thanked her for pushing him to do it. He said it was the hardest thing he'd done in years, admitting his mistakes to his daughter's face. But it was also the most important. He said he finally understood what she'd tried to show him that night at the piano. That sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that cost you something emotionally, not just financially. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. She received an email from the billionaire's daughter. The young woman introduced herself and asked if they could meet. She said her father had told her about the waitress who'd played piano, and somehow convinced him to be a better person. She wanted to know how that was even possible. They met at a quiet cafe on a Saturday afternoon. The billionaire's daughter was younger than she'd expected, probably mid-20s with tired eyes that suggested she'd been disappointed too many times to trust easily. They talked for hours. The young woman told her story, about giving up violin, about feeling like she'd betrayed herself to please a father who was never satisfied anyway, about working in a job she hated, surrounded by wealth that felt meaningless, wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. She listened, recognizing so much of her own struggle in this stranger's words. When it was her turn, she talked about loss and survival, about finding a way back to the things that matter even when the path seems impossible. The billionaire's daughter asked the question that had been hanging between them. Did she think it was too late? Could someone who'd walked away from their passion ever really find their way back? She thought about her answer carefully. Then she said that she didn't know about everyone, but she knew about herself. Every time she sat at a piano now, she was different from the girl who'd played years ago. She'd lived more, hurt more, understood more. Maybe that made her playing better, or maybe it just made it more honest. But it definitely wasn't too late. It was never too late to choose yourself, the young woman cried then quietly, wiping her eyes with a napkin. She admitted she'd kept her violin, even though she hadn't touched it in 3 years. She'd stored it in her closet, couldn't bring herself to sell it. Maybe it was time to take it back out. 6 months changed everything and nothing at all. She still woke up early most mornings, a habit from years of opening shifts that her body refused to break. But instead of rushing to catch the subway to the restaurant, she walked 3 blocks to the conservatory where she now spent her days surrounded by music. The program was harder than she'd expected. She wasn't the most technically skilled student, and there were younger pianists who'd never stopped training, who didn't have gaps in their practice history. But her teachers noticed something in her playing that couldn't be taught. One of them told her that technique could be learned, but emotion, real emotion that came from living. And she'd clearly lived. Her brother was doing better. Not cured, the doctors were careful to remind them both, but better. He'd gained 20 pounds and his energy was returning. He'd started talking about going back to school, maybe studying something he actually cared about instead of just trying to survive. He credited her for this change, but she knew it was the other way around. He'd pushed her to take the chance when she was too scared to reach for it herself. The billionaire stayed mostly in the background, which she appreciated. He checked in occasionally through his assistant, making sure she had everything she needed, but he never demanded anything in return. She'd started making small payments back to the loan, amounts she could afford from her small teaching income. He tried to refuse them at first, but she insisted. This was important to her. She needed to know she was working toward standing on her own again. His relationship with his daughter was slowly healing. It wasn't perfect, probably never would be, but they were talking. The young woman had started playing violin again, taking private lessons, considering whether it was possible to audition for programs even at her age. She and the former waitress had become something like friends, meeting every few weeks to talk about music and second chances. As spring turned to early summer, her main teacher approached her with an idea. The conservatory was organizing a benefit concert, with all proceeds going to a new scholarship fund for students from low-income families. They wanted her to be one of the featured performers. It would be her first real public performance since that night at the restaurant. She was terrified. Playing in front of her classmates and teachers was one thing. Playing in front of a packed concert hall was something else entirely. But she agreed, because saying no would mean she was still letting fear make her decisions. The concert was scheduled for a Friday evening in late summer. The venue was a beautiful historic theater downtown, the kind of place she used to dream about performing in when she was a teenager. As the date approached, she practiced obsessively, running through her program until her hands ached. She'd chosen 3 pieces for the concert. 2 were classical works from composers everyone knew, but the third was her father's composition, the same piece she'd played that night at the restaurant. She'd arranged it slightly, extended some sections, refined others, but the heart of it remained the same. The day of the concert, she arrived at the theater early for rehearsal. The space was even more impressive empty than she'd imagined it would be. The stage stretched wide under warm lights, and the seats rose up in curved rows that seemed to go on forever. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat at the grand piano for her sound check. That evening, as the audience began to arrive, she peeked out from backstage. The theater was filling quickly. She spotted her brother in the 5th row, sitting next to some of the friends he'd made at the treatment center. Her former manager from the restaurant was there too, along with several of the servers she'd worked with. The music teacher who'd first encouraged her as a child had traveled 3 hours to attend. Then she saw the billionaire arrive with his daughter. They sat together near the middle, and she noticed the young woman was carrying a program with notes written in the margins. The billionaire looked nervous, fidgeting with his phone before finally putting it away. The concert began with other performers, students whose technical skill was breathtaking. She watched from backstage, feeling her anxiety build with each piece. When it was finally her turn, she walked onto the stage to warm applause. The lights were bright enough that she could barely see the audience, which helped somehow. It made them feel less real, less intimidating. She started with the classical pieces, letting her training take over. Her fingers moved across the keys with precision, executing difficult passages she'd practiced hundreds of times. The audience was attentive and quiet. When she finished the second piece, the applause was enthusiastic. Then came her father's composition. Before she began, she did something unplanned. She spoke to the audience, her voice slightly shaky through the microphone. She told them about her father, about learning piano in a tiny apartment where the neighbors complained about the noise, about working as a waitress and believing her musical dreams were over, about one strange night when a difficult man pushed her to play, and how that moment had somehow led to all of this. She told them this concert was for everyone who'd ever had to choose between their dreams and their survival, for everyone who'd given up something they loved because life demanded it, and for everyone who found the courage to try again even when it seemed impossible. Then she played. And this time, it was different from that night at the restaurant. She wasn't playing from pain and loss anymore. She was playing from hope and possibility. The music still carried sadness, it always would. But now there was something else woven through it. Joy, gratitude, the knowledge that even broken things could be beautiful. When the final notes faded, the silence lasted only a heartbeat before the audience erupted. People stood applauding. She saw her brother wiping his eyes. The billionaire was standing too, and beside him his daughter was crying openly while clapping harder than anyone else. She stood and bowed, overwhelmed by the response. This was what her father had wanted for her all along. Not perfection, but truth. Not fame, but the freedom to share what she felt through music. After the concert, people crowded around her. Students congratulated her. Strangers told her how moved they'd been. A reporter from a local arts magazine asked for an interview. It was overwhelming and wonderful and exhausting all at once. The billionaire approached last after most of the crowd had dispersed. His daughter was with him, and they stood together in a way that suggested their relationship had genuinely changed. He thanked her, not just for the performance but for everything. For pushing him to be better, to try harder with his daughter, to understand that money couldn't buy back lost time but effort might. His daughter hugged her, whispering thank you for showing her it wasn't too late. She'd auditioned for a music program and gotten accepted. She was starting in the fall, at 26 years old, and she'd never been more terrified or more certain of anything in her life. In the months that followed, her life continued to change in small and large ways. She kept performing, building a reputation as an emerging talent. She started teaching piano to kids from backgrounds like her own, students who had ability but no resources. The Billionaire's Foundation funded these lessons, but she was the one who ran the program, who made the decisions about how to help. The restaurant where she'd worked kept the piano, but now it wasn't just decoration. Every Sunday afternoon, they hosted performances by local musicians. Many of them were people working multiple jobs, playing music on the side, hoping for a break. She performed there once a month, always playing her father's composition, always remembering where she came from. Her brother recovered enough to leave the treatment center and start living normally again. He enrolled in community college, studying something he actually cared about for the first time in years. They had dinner together every Tuesday, and sometimes she'd play piano while he studied the way they used to when they were younger. She never forgot what it felt like to be broke, exhausted, and hopeless. She never forgot the weight of choosing between dreams and survival, and she made sure that everyone she taught, everyone she performed for, understood that second chances were possible. Not easy and not guaranteed, but possible. Because sometimes all it takes is one moment of courage, one decision to be vulnerable when it would be easier to stay hidden, one person willing to push you, even if their methods aren't perfect, and one song that reminds everyone listening that we're all more than our circumstances, more than our struggles, more than what we've lost. We're also what we choose to become when given the chance.